one. Here we go.
All right, we'll use that as the cue to get going. Welcome, everyone. If we haven't met, my name is Marty West, and I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and also serve as Deputy Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance. And this is the launch of our Spring 2021 Colloquium series. It's been our habit in recent years in this series to invite in a group of practitioners to visit with us in the fall, and then in the spring devote our meetings to hearing some of the latest and most cutting edge research in education policy and politics. And so that's what we're going to be doing this spring. We have a great lineup of speakers set to join us every other week, essentially at this time on Thursdays. The only slot that is not yet full is our next meeting 2 weeks from today, but we're in conversations with a couple of different people about filling that slot, and I'm confident that we're going to have a great lineup overall. And a big part of that is our speaker today, Vladimir Kogan. He is an associate professor of political science at The Ohio State University. I hope I did that right. And Vlad is one of a group of young political scientists who are really, I think, using new forms of data collection and analysis to reinvigorate the study of the politics of education at the state and local level. And I think you'll see what I mean by that in his presentation today on the democratic deficit in U.S. education governance. So Vlad, I'm going to let you take it away. We're going to go until right about 1 p.m. We'll encourage people to use the chat to raise questions along the way, especially questions of clarification. I will bring questions to Vlad's attention if that would be useful along the way, but we can also capture them for discussion following the presentation as well. Does that work for you, Vlad?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
All right, over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an honor to present. I'm seeing so many distinguished faces staring back at me on Zoom. It's a little intimidating. So I'm just really pleased to be here and share this project with you. I have to say at the outset, so this is some joint work with my colleague Stefan Lavertu here at Glenn College at Ohio State and Zach Peskowitz at Emory. So this is a little bit of a different kind of project for us. So we are usually very much like causal identification people looking for like regression discontinuities and differences. This is not that kind of a project. This is a purely descriptive project. And we also are the kind of people that like focus on the tree. This is much more of like the forest project. And it has, I think, much more of a normative questions, normative focus, normative, I guess, implications that I think is typical for our work. So would love to get your feedback and your thoughts. And this is also kind of an accidental project. This is some data that we collected actually for another paper that has since been published on election timing and who votes in school elections. And in the process of working on that, in the process of visualizing the data, I just made some graphs just to look at the data. And when we made the graphs, we looked at them and our jaw just kind of dropped and said, wait a second, there is a different story here as well. So when we finished the election timing project, we kind of shifted focus and wanted to do this. So that's kind of the setup. Marty wanted me to mention or suggest I mention. So we did release yesterday a completely different report on impact of COVID learning loss using some fall standardized tests from Ohio. I'm not going to talk about that at all, but I will post the link for you in the chat window if you want to check it out. Happy to answer questions on that, I guess, if anybody wants, but that's not what I'll be focusing on today. All right, so thank you again. I want to start with I would admit, a little bit of odd motivating examples. And I think these examples really help set up the big normative question and the big puzzle or phenomena that I want to kind of talk about, which is we're going to call the democratic deficit and how we govern public education in the US. And so please bear with me as I walk you through these 4 examples. I know they're going to be a little bit odd, maybe in some cases maybe a little bit offensive, but I think they do illustrate really important dynamics of local governance. And they're going to lead to...
Let me jump in for one second. Do you have a slide deck that you want us to be seeing?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Can you see it now?
We can.
Perfect. All right. And so here's, go to that front slide. Thank you so much for letting me know. All right. So yeah, here's my co-authors. They're here. So just make sure I mention who they are. So if you want to learn more about their work. So again, I'm going to start with 4 examples that will lead to documenting this empirical regularity that I think we're going to call the democratic deficit. And then I want to end with implications and kind of the big picture issues. So I've been on many Zoom meetings and many Zoom presentations. I tend to spend that time like checking my email or catching up on stuff I'm behind on. So I'm going to try to make this as entertaining, interactive as possible. So I know Marty said if you have questions, put it in the chat. Happy to answer questions as we go as well if you want to raise your hand. I think the more interactive, the better, so that we all stay awake. So let me start with the 4 anecdotes. And so Michael Hartney's here, I see in the audience. So the first is actually going to be from one of his recent papers. This is joint work with Leslie Finger. And so this is a paper where they look at school reopening decisions this fall. And they show that there's a striking correlation between Trump vote share in 2016 and percent of students who began the fall with in-person school. And in fact, they show that this is probably the single best predictor of whether schools reopen in a given area. And it turns out that like health indicators, how many COVID tests there were, seem to completely not predict school reopening decisions. And I think it raises some kind of interesting questions. Why is adult politics really driving these decisions about kids? So I think we can try to rationalize it in a number of ways. We know probably Trump vote share is correlated with like race of voters. We know that there are some big racial preference gaps in whether parents feel comfortable sending their kids back to school. But I think it raises a puzzle worth exploring, which is again, why does adult politics? Why is it so central to this issue? All right, let me give another example. So this is from my home school district. I'm going to show you a clip from a video. So before COVID, I used to love going to school board meetings. It's really fascinating. And I happen to be in the audience at this one. And to give you some background, so Columbus is a majority Black school district. It's about, I think, 70% African-American. And at this particular school board meeting, this was about a year and a half ago. So Columbus was on the verge of getting taken over by the state because of our low achievement. And so at this particular meeting, one of the people, so I have in the past spoken in public comment. I like to bring giant signs. So I wasn't speaking in public comment this time, but the president of the local chapter of the NAACP was there. And I thought, oh, this is incredible, right? Our foremost civil rights organization is here to advocate for kids. And so let me show you a clip. So she is speaking about an item on the agenda involving the budget. So the district was trying to spend about $150,000 of Title I money. And so here it is. I'm going to pause it in a second as we get part of the way through.
President Baker and members of the board and the Superintendent Dixon, I'm going to be very brief. I want to talk about agenda item 12.4, $175,000 to be spent with the convention center on an activity, I believe next school year. I understand that this is a federal grant. I don't have a copy of that grant, but I would like for someone to share with the NAACP what that grant was for.
Okay, so then she pauses and the superintendent responds. And the superintendent, her name is Dr. Dixon. She said, hey, listen, I'm a new superintendent. I just took over. I want to have a convocation at the beginning of the year where I lay out my vision for the district. We have 9,000 employees. We don't have any buildings in the district where we can fit all 9,000. And so we're going to rent out the convention center, bring them all in and do this rah, rah, rah rally. And that's an allowable use of Title I funding, et cetera. And by the way, this is me right here sitting in the back. So proof that I was actually there. So it's kind of an interesting back and forth. And I thought, I wonder what the president of the NAACP is going to say, right? Again, is she going to be concerned that this is maybe not a great use of Title I money? And her reaction, her response really floored me. And so here's what happens next.
I also want to know, I learned from the convention center that they outsource businesses. I want to know, how will you ensure that Black businesses get a piece of this $175,000? Thank you.
President Watson, and Madam Superintendent, would you like to plan to follow up with President Watson to answer her questions? Okay, thank you very much.
So wait a minute, I'm going to get a follow-up. I can't get it now.
All right. So to me, that was kind of shocking, right? There's nothing about kids here, right? This is about contractors getting some of the district's money. And I was I was kind of a little bit startled. So there's a great book called The Color of School Reform that I think really illustrates this in powerful ways, that historically, because of private discrimination in the private labor market, government employment was seen as really important in minority communities because there was less discrimination there. And so some argue that's also a barrier to school reform efforts because it puts kind of adult interests and employment needs ahead of a student. And I think, again, this is an illustration here where everybody's talking about adults, right? Adult contractors, adult employees, nothing to do with kids, which again, is kind of odd. So let me give you a third example, which is going to be a little bit different. So in 2010, Governor Jerry Brown is the elected governor. He passes a big income tax increase by voters to go to schools. And in 2013, he gives the State Address, where he lays out this principle of subsidiarity. So he went to Jesuit seminary while he was there. He read a lot about political theory, and he became this big proponent of subsidiarity. And so this is from his State of the State Address. He says, "This year, as you consider new education laws, I ask you to consider the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the idea that a central authority should only perform those tasks which cannot be performed at a more immediate or local level. In other words, higher or more remote levels of government, like the state, should render assistance to local school districts, but should always respect their primary jurisdiction and the dignity and freedom of teachers and students." So he passes this big overhaul of funding. California had a very complicated school funding system, and essentially, as they poured billions of new dollars in, they scrapped it. They got rid of all the categorical programs, and they just created a weighed funding formula where districts got money for each student, and the more poor students and English learners you had, the more you got per student. But then they left it to the local districts to spend. And the idea is, we're going to give you more money for these disadvantaged students, but you know how best to design programs to address their needs. So this overhaul takes place, huge increase in school spending in California. A few years later, there are some analyses done. So the state auditor 2 years ago does a report on this new funding formula and really concludes that the state approach has not ensured that significant funding is benefiting students as intended to close achievement gaps. The Legislative Analyst Office, which is an independent analyst that works for the state legislature, kind of came to the same conclusion. It said, listen, we spent all this money. It's supposed to go specifically to help these disadvantaged groups to close these achievement gaps. But the gaps on test scores really have not closed since we enacted this formula. And there's a variety of investigations. There's a class action lawsuit in Los Angeles suggesting that districts took this money, supposed to go to disadvantaged students, but really spent it on other stuff. So in Los Angeles, they said, well, if we increase salaries for all teachers, that will provide better teachers for everyone, and therefore that will help disadvantaged students, even though that's not necessarily targeted to the students that are supposed to be benefiting from this extra appropriation. So this is a story, I think, of kids, but some kids' interests getting less of a priority than others. All right, so last example, I promise. So East Ramapo Central School District, this is a famous example you may have heard of. This is a suburban district in New York State. It's a diverse district, so it's about 67% white, but it has a large Black large Latino population. So what's so interesting is the public schools, there's about 10,000 students, 92% are Black or Latino. Most of the white residents in East Ramapo are Orthodox Jews, so they send their kids to private religious schools. And in fact, there's 30,000 private religious school students in East Ramapo, and they're 98% white. And so for a long time, so New York, you may know, has annual budget elections. And so this district was really concerned. We have all these parents who don't send their kids here. How do we prevent them from voting down our budgets? And so they made a deal where they said, we're going to keep property taxes low. We'll pay for special ed services for private school kids. And then in exchange, you agree not to vote down our budgets. So that worked for a while, but eventually the Orthodox Jewish community got frustrated. They wanted special ed services in the private schools rather than kids having to go to public school campus. And then they just took over the school board. They elected a white Jewish majority. And then they cut the public district to the bone. Like they got rid of the full day kindergarten. They massively increased funding for the special ed programs for the private school students. They hired a consultant who said the district was going to have enrollment losses, used that to justify closing 2 of the schools, and then sold them massively below appraisal to the private schools to take over. And so this was featured on an episode of This American Life. I encourage you to listen to it. It's fantastic. And so one of the people they talked to is a former school board president. And they basically asked him, hey, did the Orthodox Jewish majority, did you guys just take over and like just basically look out for the interests of the private school kids? And the exchange is really fascinating. So I'm going to play it for you. It's about a minute. I think it reveals a lot.
They were there for that one main purpose, is to make sure the services private students are supposed to get are given, and that the public school was functioning properly.
Is there something inherently uncomfortable about a system being governed by folks who don't use that system or wouldn't want to use that system? Is there something that's uncomfortable just about that?
Right. Well, it's very understandable people would see it that way. It's uncomfortable or, unfair.
So I think it's a great exchange. And in some ways, I think that is really ties all these 4 examples together. And so here's what I mean. Sorry. So
they were there.
I think across these 4 examples, I think it's clear that often what happens at the local level in these schools is really about adults, about adult politics in the context of reopening. It's about adult jobs in the context of that Columbus example, really not necessarily related to student needs. And when it is related to student needs, it's not obvious that it's actually like the needs of most students, right? In the case of the California funding model, it doesn't seem like disadvantaged students really got their fair shake. In the case of East Ramapo, again, it was about the private school kids. And so our paper is really about the question that the producer asked this school board president: is there something inherently uncomfortable about a school system being governed by folks who don't use that system, who don't want to use that system? And what I want to convince you or show you today is that East Ramapo, I think, is actually really representative. It's a really extreme example, but I think it's really representative of how school governance works across the United States. And so I'm going to give you some data that's going to demonstrate this, that I think is going to help us rationalize all these 4 examples and help understand why things work the way that they do. And again, I think at the core of it is how we govern schools. All right. So here's what we did for this project. Again, this is kind of an outgrowth from a broader project. So we collected data on school board elections in about 20 states. Today, I'm going to focus on just 4 of them: California, Illinois, Ohio, and Oklahoma. Why these 4? Because they're big states with many school districts and also a large number of heavily non-white school districts. It turns out most states have just overwhelmingly white districts. So we tracked down all the school board election data as part of this broader project. Happy to share it on our website as well. So second, we got data on students in these districts. So what do students look like in terms of their race and ethnicity? What do students look like in terms of their income? And data on test scores from the Stanford Education Data Archive. So third, we also got data on voters. So once we knew the election date for each school board election, we could go to the voter file in each state, and we could, in each district, see who voted on that date. And working with a firm called Catalyst, which is a big national vendor that works primarily with Democrats, they have purchased a lot of proprietary commercial data about voters. So they work with like Experian, they work with like your credit card company, so they know a lot about you. They know your income, they know whether you have kids, they estimate race. So we basically know who are the voters that are electing school boards in these communities. And again, combining what's in the voter file with some of these other data sources, we can kind of characterize the composition of the electorate. And so what this is going to be really is a project comparing voters who are electing school boards to students who are being educated in the public schools and asking how similar are they? And to preview, the answer is not that similar. All right. So again, feel free to jump in if you have questions. I'm going to walk you through, I think, the 3 main patterns that we see again and again. So I think the first question we asked, kind of similar along the lines of East Ramapo, is how many voters who are electing school boards actually have kids? So not necessarily kids in public schools, but just kids in the household. All right, that's the first question. How many voters who elect school boards to govern schools for kids actually have kids themselves? So we have some data from this consumer company that Catalyst works with. They classify each voter into 3 categories. There's kids likely in the household, kids possible in the household, or kids unlikely. So we try to be, really conservative, try to overestimate the number of people with kids. So we just take these 2 groups, likely and possible, add them together, and then we just look at the distribution. Right, in the average school board election, what % of people are likely or at least possibly have kids? And if you look across the 4 states, the answer is there's variation. So here's kind of the distribution. Here's the interquartile range. But for the median election, for the average election, even for the 75th percentile election in 3 of these states, most voters don't have kids. All right, so that's the first finding. Right, in the typical school board election, most voters don't actually have kids. Again, not just in the public schools, but just kids, period. Which again is important, right? Because when the interests of adults and the interests of kids are not aligned, is this a system where we are potentially putting the thumb on the interests of adults because they're the ones who are voting, and many of them don't actually have kids of their own? All right, so that's the first question. So the second question is, okay, well, maybe they don't have kids, but certainly they care about property values. Property values are based on school quality. So, they might have some stake too. How similar are they? We know schools are segregated, even within districts. So it's really important to know, right, whether the adults at least look like the kids. Are they from the same neighborhood as the kids who are being educated? So we have data on voter race. I'm happy to talk about how that's estimated. We correct for kind of the most extreme measurement error you can think of. Doesn't really change the conclusions. We have some data on income that we can compare to the income thresholds for free and reduced lunch eligibility. And so what I'm going to give you is just some really simple scatter plots, some bin scatter plots. And in some cases, I'll show you just some basic regression fits, but really this is all descriptive. So I'm going to show you the 45-degree line. So if the voters and the students look exactly the same, right, everything should be on that 45-degree line. I'm also going to show you another line at 50%. So when do voters become 50% white versus 50% non-white? And we think 50% is important because we have plurality elections. So if you control 50% of the vote, then you are kind of the pivotal voting bloc. And then at the bottom, I'm going to have some rug plots that gives you a sense of the distribution of the districts in our sample. I'm going to show you 3 of the states in the interest of time. Ohio looks quite similar. It has fewer minority districts in terms of students, but everything is going to look very similar. All right, so here's the setup. Here's every slide I'm going to show you is going to look like this. So on the x-axis is % of white students in the school district. On the y-axis is % of white voters in that school board election for that district. We average across all the elections over about an 8-year period. This is the 45-degree line. So if it's above the line, white voters are more numerous than white students, and vice versa. And this is where, above this line, we have a white voter majority. And again, I'm going to do a bin scatter plot where we're going to take districts and kind of combine them and then just plot the averages. So on this right side, it's going to be a little bit different. So on the x-axis is % of students who qualify for free reduced lunch. We account for community eligibility and impute that percentage using the CETA data. On the y-axis is % of voters with family income under 40,000, which is pretty close to what the income threshold is for a family of 4 during the period we study to qualify for free reduced price lunch. All right, so here's the data. Here's what it looks like. Here's California. So basically, this is above the 45-degree line. So there's always more white voters than there are white students. And the gap is pretty huge. So once a district has about 15% white students, the white voters have a voting majority. And that majority just gets bigger on average the more white students you have. So a district that's 85% non-white is going to have a majority white voting population. All right. So here, this is kind of the same story. There's fewer voters that have low enough incomes to qualify for free reduced lunch than there are kind of share of students. So here, again, being below the line means that poor families are underrepresented in the political process relative to kids. Here, being above the line means that white parents, white residents are overrepresented relative to kids. So bad up on this side, above 45 is bad. On this side, below 45 is bad, or means groups are underrepresented. So this is California. This is Illinois. You can see it looks quite similar in terms of race. Again, once you get to a district that's about 20% white, in terms of students, the voting majority is like 60% white and just goes up from there. The income disparities are narrower. Again, I think our measure of income is a little bit less clean, so that could explain also some of the differences between race and income. But I think the race patterns are going to be really, really stark. And here's Oklahoma. So Oklahoma has a lot fewer, like overwhelmingly non-white districts, but it has a decent number of majority non-white districts. And there, the racial disparity is even more stark. So again, once you get to a district that's about 10% white, the electorate is 80% white on average, and just goes up from there. So you have, I think, consistently, and the same thing in Ohio, most majority non-white school districts in terms of students have a majority white electorate, an overwhelmingly majority white electorate. And again, you see the same income gap, but it's less stark. So that story of East Ramapo, where you have white voters controlling the school board, even though their kids aren't attending the schools, that's actually like the story of most majority non-white school districts in America. That's how school board elections work in these places. The voters don't have kids, and they really, for the most part, in terms of race and ethnicity, look nothing like the kids. So that's I think the big takeaway here, right? So voters who are electing school boards look very different than the students that are actually attending public schools. The gap at least seems most pronounced in terms of race, rather also there for income, but less pronounced. The most majority non-white school districts, about 2/3 of them, have a majority white electorate, kind of like East Ramapo. And so next we say, well, why is this important? Is this something worth thinking about? So we define a new metric, we call it a democratic deficit, which is going to be the difference between what the voters look like, what the students look like. All right. So essentially, we're going to take percent of white voters and subtract percent of white students. So the higher the number now, the less represented the school district, the more white voters are overrepresented. All right. And we want to say, well, does it matter? Should this be concerning to us? So this is from California. This is, and again, we have data from the other states in the paper. So on the y-axis, we use the CETA data, and we plot the average racial achievement gap. So white minus Hispanics student achievement. So again, higher numbers mean bigger disparity, where Latino students are underperforming white students. And what you see is, again, it's not particularly, well, I guess it depends on your measure. So there is a positive relationship there. And in fact, in substantive terms, it's actually, again, when you think about the average deficit, it's actually pretty substantial. But the story is, the bigger the disparity between students and voters in terms of race, the bigger the disparity in student achievement. Now, I want to emphasize, we're not saying this is causal. We're not saying that one is causing the other. In fact, I don't think this is causal at all. I think it's the same factors that cause disparities in achievement also affecting political participation. We try to get this a little bit in the paper, where we do some more sophisticated modeling. We use commuter zone fixed effects, where we compare just neighboring districts, and this relationship holds. But again, we don't think this is causal. But nevertheless, even if it's not causal, I think there is a really important normative implication here, which is that if we think school boards will close or will do something about racial achievement gaps in response to voter pressure, we think voter pressure is going to be partly a function of voter interests, then our interpretation is that the districts where you have the largest racial achievement gaps are also districts where potentially you have school boards that don't face a lot of pressure to do anything about those achievement gaps, because voters look very different from the students, right? The voters are all white, and it's not clear that white voters care all that much about the achievement of non-white students. And so Michael has done some great work on this, including a survey experiment of California school boards. And if you just ask them, and again, they did it in a clever way where there was no social desirability issues. Most school board members in California said voters don't seem to care all that much about racial achievement gaps. They just said it's not a really top priority for their voters, even school board members in really diverse districts with big achievement gaps. So I think what the school board members are seeing, the message that the voters are sending to them is, hey, racial achievement gaps are not that important. And we think this might be why, because most voters are white and they care about their kids. Maybe they care about their kids' neighborhood school, which is probably majority white. They don't necessarily care all that much about the school across town that's not majority white, but nobody from that area is voting in these board elections. So if we think about democracy as elected officials responding to voters, the voters look very different. Again, think of East Ramapo, very different than the kids being educated. Okay, so what are the implications? What do we do with this? And so let me just lay out a couple, I think, thoughts. And again, this is something we've been thinking about, so I would love your feedback and your reactions to these thoughts. I think for us, one question that asks is, well, why is it that we kind of fetishize over local control in the United States over education? Like, nobody else really has the same decentralized system of governance. And if we look, and I spent the last couple of years just reading a lot of history, it turns out it's not that in the United States, we didn't create local school districts because some social planner sat down and said, what is the optimal governance system for serving the needs of kids? But some of you may know this, but this is just a historical accident. So like in 1649, in Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritans were very concerned about kids being able to read. And so they passed the law. It's actually incredible. Its name is called Old Deluder Satan Law of 1649. That's the actual title of the law. It's like 3 paragraphs long. And it says, every township, once you have 50 households, you got to provide school. So kids can learn to read so they can read the Bible. That's how we got local school districts. Like the Puritans said, you got to make sure kids can read the Bible so that Satan doesn't steal their soul. And so we're going to ask townships to do it. And I think from there, as far as I can tell from reading some of the history, this was just kind of a policy diffusion story, right? Massachusetts was the first to create a public school system. So then when Connecticut created theirs, they were like, well, what's Massachusetts doing? Oh, they're having local governments do it. Let's try that. And so there was kind of this diffusion story where everybody just copied Massachusetts. And this historical accident kind of built on itself. And now this is the system we got. And I think the other thing that really I didn't appreciate is how much this has changed, right? You know, what local control means today is very different than what local control meant even 60 years ago. So even in 1948, we had about 10 times more school districts than we have today. So we have very different kind of local control today. And so there's, I think, really fascinating historical work about how grade banded schools and the creation of high schools that necessitated a bigger feeder pattern really led to consolidation. But I think there's nothing magical or sacred about local control, right? It's not like we designed the system intentionally. It's not like this is a system that we thought at the outset was ideal for students. And it's not like we haven't changed it in the past. So, you know, I think perhaps one of the questions we should ask, which is asked in this article in The Atlantic about 12 years ago, is, you know, are school boards the problem, right? If we want to fix local schools, is part of this really the governance issue? And is it about how who's running the schools, the school boards? And I think what we add to the conversation is how they're elected, who they're accountable to. You know, in some ways, this brings me back to Chubb and Mo's really outstanding book that has had a profound impact on my thinking. So they have a quote where they're talking about kind of failure of school reform. They say, you know, in our view, the most fundamental causes of low academic performance are really far obvious, given the way the schools are commonly understood, and far less susceptible to change than how many education reformers think about it. They are, in fact, the very institutions that are supposed to be solving the problem, the institutions of direct democratic control. And so I don't think Chubb and Mo were thinking about it in our terms, in terms of do voters look like the students? But I think we help provide some evidence for the underlying mechanisms that I think support this argument, right? So I think their point was, listen, kids don't vote, adults vote. So it's not obvious that we're incentivizing school boards to do what's good for kids. And I think our follow-up is, that's true. And most of these adults don't have kids and look nothing like the kids. So it's even less obvious that we have a system that incentivizes school boards to do the right thing for the kids they're educating. All right. So I'll end with this, which is, you know, what do we do? Like, what are the policy implications? And you know, I think this is something we want to take seriously. You know, we don't want to kind of engage in the nirvana fallacy where we're comparing an imperfect system to some ideal that we know is not going to happen. We want to say, well, what is the most realistic counterfactual? Maybe it's just as bad or worse. So let me walk you through 3 things that we've considered. And I saw the question in the chat window. I'll return to it in just a few seconds. It's a great question. So the first possibility is maybe the answer is just more centralization, right? Have states take over failing schools. That's what we tried in Ohio. That's what we tried in other places. I think the empirical evidence for this working well, I think, is pretty mixed. I know it worked in Lawrence, Massachusetts, but there's also many cases where I think it hasn't worked that well. And theoretically, it's not obvious to us why state policymakers or state legislators are going to be any more interested in the needs of kids than local school board members, because they're still going to be responsible, ultimately accountable to the same voters. In fact, they're probably going to be even more white, right? If you're a majority non-white district, you're probably in a state where most of the state legislators represent white suburbs or rural areas. So it's not obvious that this really changes the core governance challenge. So option two we consider is maybe election reforms, right? Can we change how elections are run so that we can amplify the voices of those whose voices are not being heard that well because of participation? So there's a couple of things we consider. I think we have pretty good evidence for, which is, the first is what we started off with, which is election timing. I think we have pretty strong evidence that on-cycle elections, you get an electorate that is more non-white, an electorate where a larger share of voters have kids. I don't want to overstate the size of those effects. I think, again, many of these biases are still there. They're just a little bit smaller. And we don't know, the general equilibrium effects. There's other differences between off-cycle and on-cycle elections, like the cost of campaigns, the cost of advertising. So it's not obvious that some of those countervailing effects wouldn't offset some of the benefits. We also know that moving from at-large to district elections is really effective at increasing the number of minorities elected to office. And we have some other work showing that when you have more minorities on school boards, that relative achievement of non-white students does seem to improve. We have evidence from a regression discontinuity paper that we wrote recently. There is a great paper by economics PhD student at the University of Virginia using a different identification strategy, finding the same thing. And so institutions that elect more minorities could be helpful. But again, there's costs, right? We know that district or ward elections, you get much more kind of, my district at the expense of the greater good. So we can imagine, again, there could be countervailing things that potentially offset some of these representational gains. And so the last thing that I think is worth thinking about is, school choice, right? Charter schools. And if we think the problem is that voters are not looking out for the interests of students, then in some ways, school choice seemed like a natural solution because it's about empowering parents. It's not about empowering voters. It's not about empowering interest groups or contractors. It's the parents. So, I think we have pretty good evidence in urban areas that charter schools are better. Doug Harris's book on New Orleans, I think, really shows that it can work at scale, but also suggests the importance of having the right set of regulations in terms of information, in terms of admission, and things like that. So I think we have to be careful again about how we do this. But to us, this seems like, again, a strong case for reforms that really reduce the power of voters over education policy and really increase the power of parents. And so that's, I think, kind of where we end up. We have this problem. We think it's really at the core of what's wrong with education governance. It's not clear to us what the fixes are, but we do think it's something that we got to tackle, because we think unless we fix governance, we should really not expect school boards, local control to do much, especially for these disadvantaged students. So happy to take questions. I see one in the chat, Paul. So we do have data on, we don't have data on whether voters are employed by the school district. We do have data on whether they have a license to be a teacher. So we can measure what % of voters are teachers in any given election. And so we do some of that in our earlier paper on election timing. And it turns out that very, very few voters are actually teachers, even in really low turnout elections. Now, whether it's a big enough voting block or not, I know Michael has a follow-on paper kind of arguing with us, saying that even if most voters are not teachers, teachers can still be potentially pivotal and have influence. But it's very rare to have an election, even a super low turnout off-cycle election, where more than 10% of voters are educators or school staff, which to us suggests that maybe I think the argument about interest group influence interest groups dominating these elections is probably, again, to us seems like it's overstated. I think we think it's really the much bigger problem is voters that don't have kids, that really don't care about the schools and whose interests aren't aligned with the kids, not necessarily because they're employees, but because of these other dimensions. So thank you.
So Vladimir, thank you for a eye-opening and thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to pause you there for 1 second to say thank you and sort of transition into some questions and discussion. I'm going to encourage people to either, as someone has already done, type questions into the chat, or to raise your hands under the participants tab. Vlad, I'll encourage you to stop sharing your screen at this point so that we can see as many
there we go.
of our colleagues as possible at the same time. I'll get the discussion started with two very basic questions. One is, I don't think, unless I missed it, that you told us what the turnout rate was in these elections, which would seem to have sort of implications for the scope to, I don't know, use election reforms to try to offset some of the Democratic deficit. So that's one. And then the second thing that I was struck by is how similar the patterns were across the three states that you showed. And you said that Ohio is similar. What does that similarity allow you to sort of possibly rule out as possible explanations? It seems like, I imagine the electoral systems differ in California and Illinois and Oklahoma in ways that sort of maybe would point you in another direction, given that you see such similar patterns across the three settings. So I'll let you start with that, and then we have some other people wanting to join.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is a fantastic set of questions. So great question about turnout. And the answer is it depends on when the election is held. So if it's an off-cycle election, we have some data on this in our earlier paper, but off-cycle, which means not in November of even year, not during a statewide primary, turnout is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 15 to 20% of the voting age population. All right, so 15 to 20% of the voting age population. Turnout in a presidential election, so if a school board election is held at the same time, turnout is closer to like 50 or 60% of the voting age population. Now, one limitation is we know who's turning out. We don't know if they're voting in every race. So we know that this ballot roll-off, so who is actually voting in school board elections during these high turnout elections is probably a smaller subset, but our best estimates of roll-off is that, again, most voters are still voting, so you do see a big increase. So I guess the short answer is it really depends. So one thing that to your second question, also relevant to this is, the three states, except for California, they all have off-cycle elections. So in some ways, one common thing about them is that they all have these elections that are really low turnout. California is the exception. California, we see variations. Some school districts have elections that are November, some don't. And again, in the previous paper, we show that this does matter on the margin. So you do get an electorate where, again, more people have kids. You do have an electorate that's a little bit less non-white, but those are relatively small effects. So it doesn't change the main narrative, which is most voters don't have kids. Most voters are not are white, even in majority non-white districts. It just, I think, will shrink those gaps a little bit. So I think to us, it does suggest that, again, election timing is part of the story here. But it's not necessarily like what's driving it. So what else can we rule out? It's a really good question. I think the minority out group here is different. So in Oklahoma, it's primarily Latino students. A lot of them are non-citizens. So one might worry, is this really a story about citizenship, people not being eligible to vote? If you look in Ohio and to a small extent Illinois, it's primarily African Americans. Most of them are citizens, and you see the same pattern. So for us, it doesn't seem like this is a story about formal barriers to political participation. It's not a story that if we just increased registration rates amongst minority voters, we would close these gaps. Seems to us a story about just who cares enough to vote, or who has the time and who turns out in these low turnout elections. And I think those dynamics are much harder to change. So I guess that's kind of a two-part answer to your two-part question. Happy to follow up if others want to kind of go along the same lines.
Yeah, consistent with that, Paul Peterson just shared some facts in the chat that in New Mexico, there was a switch recently from off-cycle to on-cycle elections, and nothing changed in terms of the incumbency rate, which may sort of suggest that these minor changes in electoral systems may not really produce large results. Ira, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to dig a little more into what seems like the underlying assumption that that like the school board voters, the people who run the school board should be the ones with kids. Like, isn't it possible that that people without kids would have a strong interest? Like, they could be employers who are concerned about getting a skilled workforce, or they could own the house next to the school and like not want allowed recess. Or I mean, I those are just some possible ones. And I'm thinking like of other areas where if someone suggested that, like, I don't know, like only prisoners should vote on the prison budget, or only like people who serve in the military should vote for the military budget, like we would think that would be, you know, we would question that assumption. So I wonder, like, just if you could talk about, your data was really interesting, but I just wonder if you could like uh, explore that assumption a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, such a great question. Thank you for that. And I guess I was not careful enough in kind of how I framed this. So I completely agree. We're not arguing that like only people with kids should get a say, but we are arguing that kids are a pretty important constituency here, and it seems like right now their interests are not at the top of listeners' priorities, right? And so our argument is simply that if we want an education system that serves kids, we got to have a system of incentives that incentivizes the policymakers to actually care about kids. And it's not obvious to us that the current system does that well. Certainly, again, as I said, homeowners care because it's not their property values. But I think here, and especially the racial dimension, is where I think that the big normative problems lie. And again, I'm going to go back to that California example, right? That wasn't a story about people without kids getting what they want, which was kind of, or without kids in the public schools just getting what they want, which was the East Ramapo story. But this was a case in California where it was really wealthy white parents who were hijacking revenue that was designed to go to disadvantaged students, primarily poor non-white students. But because those groups did not have, they were not participating at high rates, that's not who the money was spent on, right? In California, you had LA Unified that took money designed for Latino English learners and spent it in like rich white neighborhood schools benefiting the white kids. So I think this is also a story about not just kids versus other interests, which I think is important, but also like whose kids benefit, which schools get the resources. I think that's tied into these mechanisms as well. Because again, even if it's parents voting, not all parents care about all kids. And so I think it's really those power dynamics internally about which subgroups get prioritized. How much do we care about the achievement of the students who are behind versus our own kids? That I think is at stake here. But we completely acknowledge that we don't argue only kids matter, only kids should hire teachers. We just say if we want schools to educate kids, we got to make sure that's what the incentives are aligned to do. And it's not obvious to us that this is a system of incentives that really does a good job of, again, putting the interests of kids on the same playing field as the interests of, say, adult employees, or the interests of homeowners who care about property taxes and want to keep them low, and all those considerations. So I completely agree. So thank you for raising that question. Thank you.
So there's one person on this or in this meeting who wrote satirically at one point, perhaps not satirically, that children should be given the right to vote, or maybe parents should be given an additional vote for each child as a way of balancing the interests appropriately. Which suggests suggests the importance of a comment in the chat from Anil asking about the idea of student representation on boards, and whether you've done any work or looked at attempts to incorporate student voice into school board elections. Then we'll get to Emmerich and Paul.
Yeah, thanks for that question. We have not done any work on it. I think that's a really good question. I would say, one of the things I'm really passionate about here at OSU is like convincing people that student evaluations of teaching are really, really bad. I think the evidence is overwhelming that students are really terrible at judging teaching. I think there's been some interesting work in Chicago that compare student surveys of teacher quality with teacher value added. It suggests that student surveys of teacher quality are completely uncorrelated with value added. They might capture other dimensions of teaching that are important. So I don't want to say that value added test scores are everything, but it does give me some caution, right? That it's not obvious that like we should just give kids the keys and let them run the schools, because then we'll probably have a lot of recess and ice cream and movies. So again, I can't say that student representation wouldn't change the dynamic, but I definitely want to see some evidence to make sure it works better than student evaluations of teaching amongst college students.
Emmerich.
Thank you, Marty, and Vlad. Thank you so much for this. This was fascinating. I had a question about sort of broader political representation. As I was hearing you speak, I wanted to hear your thoughts about whether this is a school and education problem, or this is a problem of larger inequalities in political representation in U.S. governments more broadly, right? So if you were to ask this question about public transportation, and do the people that use public transportation are the ones most likely to vote on issues of public transportation? My guess is, I don't know, but my guess is the answer would be no, right? So when both thinking through the implications and reforms, like, is this a problem of sort of fixing political representation and inequality in US governments more broadly, or is there something specific about education and schools that makes this problem different?
Yeah, great. Again, another fantastic question. Thank you. So I do think this is a broader issue. And so there's a great book, Brian Schaffner and Ray Laraja, I think it's called Hometown Inequality. They do kind of a similar analysis for city elections, and they find, I think, very similar kinds of things. So strongly recommend that book. So I do think this is, again, a broader, it's a start of, I think, a broader, or a part of a broader conversation about, again, whose interests represented. And I think, so I guess I would say two things. One is, I do think for some services, we do have alternative governance models, like transportation, right? We do have, appointed commissions and things like that. It's not obvious that's better, but, I think designed, I think, in some ways to insulate some of these service providers from local pressure, maybe with the hope that they prioritize kind of service quality. I think the big difference is, bus drivers can vote, right? There's not that many of them, but they can vote, right? People that use community centers and libraries, they can all vote, right? Kids can't vote, right? So I think the level of kind of proxy representation that we're relying on in education, I think, is what makes it unique, that we are relying on adults to have kids' interests at heart. And so I think that's why we have to really interrogate this, I think, really closely to see, is there a reason to think that would happen? Is there a reason to think that these adults who are voting are going to be aligned with interests of kids? Because that's the only mechanism that kid interests have to gain representation through this process. And so I think that's the one distinction. But I completely agree. This is a broader pattern in American, especially local democracy. And definitely check out Ray's and Brian's book on cities. That again illustrates many of the same kinds of patterns.
Let me call on Paul Hill and say how great it is to have you join us via the magic of Zoom. I don't think you'd be in the room if we were in person. Oh, but you have to turn off the mute.
I always want to find out what other Buckeyes are doing. Just a question of the connection between representation and board agendas. And I know that was what your study was about, but a fair question about whether a highly unrepresented board is going to attend to different issues altogether than one that is. And I'm reflecting on this because I'm thinking a lot about what's gotten in the way of reform strategies in a lot of big cities. And I've come to think that the union is as important as everybody thought it was, but the white parents are even more important, because as soon as any reform starts to impinge on their privileges, it goes away. Anyway.
Yeah, so great question. And Paul gave us some feedback on an earlier draft of this project as well. So definitely deeply influenced by all your thinking on this issue. So I think it's a good question. I guess I'll plug another project related to that. So AJ Crable at the Council of Great City Schools does a lot of training of school boards. And so he and a group of us academics, so Leslie Finger, Brad at the University of Nevada, we're basically going to task school board members with watching school board meetings and coding what they actually do. What do they talk about? How much time do they spend on stuff? Who's showing up to speak? And create a database of this data, because I don't think any of us really know on a day-to-day basis what school boards do in public. Again, they can do a lot of things in private, but what do they do in public? What do they talk about? How important are kid issues? So we don't know, and hopefully this data, for those of you who are interested, will become available. So for AJ, this is like a effort to train school board members to care about kids. So watch what other school boards do and learn from how bad they are, and so you don't do the same thing. But for us, it's also a data generating process. And so we've got a bunch of state school boards associations signed on where they're going to have their members code all these meetings for us for free because they want to use it as a training opportunity. So if you're interested in school board governance, this data is coming in the next few years. So definitely stay tuned, because I think we'll actually have at least a sense, that's not anecdotal, of like, what is it that school members talk about when they meet, who's showing up and speaking in public comment, what are the kinds of things they're talking about. And so in preparation for this, as we were creating the code book, we spent the last 4 months, like every week, watching a different school board meeting. And I got to tell you, it's so painful, so painful. It's not about kids. It's like a mom complaining about, a building, and they want to make sure that there's a second elevator in the back, or like some crazy person showing up to try to sell their curriculum that they think is better than the curriculum that the district has now, or people complaining about random stuff. So I think we'll be shocked by what it is school board members actually do and what they spend their time debating. But so stay tuned. That's coming in the near future.
Great. So we only have about 2 minutes left, and I know there are two people who want to ask questions, Taryn and Taylor. So I'm going to actually ask each of them to talk briefly with a quick question. Then Vlad, I'm going to let you take it home, answer whatever you can, and leave us with whatever words of wisdom you'd like to impart. So Taryn.
Great, I'll go quickly then. Fantastic presentation, thanks so much. I was really curious about the slide you showed on the representation of white voters and the achievement gap. And I was wondering if the achievement gap metric was robust, and instead if you used minority student achievement or white achievement, whether you would see the same story. Because I think of Cleveland as an example where there's probably a small achievement gap that's not necessarily because both students, Black and white students, are doing particularly well.
And Taylor.
I'll be very, very brief. Vladimir, thank you so much for the insightful presentation. As you were talking about those more realistic solutions for electoral reform and how that relates to educational governments, I was wondering if through your research, maybe perhaps even on an international perspective, you maybe had come across a model that could provide benefit to the more state-based. Just if you saw a model that you were able to draw benefit from that could apply to this at all.
Yeah, so thank you for those questions. So the second question, I actually know very little about school governance in other countries. So I think that's a great question that I just don't know the answer to. To the first question, we played around with the CETA achievement data. I don't recall what the results were for the individual achievement rates, but you're absolutely right. That's definitely, I think, an important thing to think about. So we'll definitely take another look. Thank you. And I guess my last parting words is, I encourage you all to listen to the This American Life episode. It's called "A Not So Simple Majority" on East Ramapo, because I think it just illustrates, just so powerfully all these issues, and it's just so well done. So that's my one plug. Check out This American Life.
Excellent. Well, Vladimir, thank you for getting this semester off to a great start for us. I'll let everyone know that we'll be back here 2 weeks from today, and we'll get word out on exactly what our agenda will comprise then in the next couple of days. But thanks, Vladimir, for a great session.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.